His PhD. He was a PhD student at Louis until he met Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educationist, and got into the world of activism, and he's been there since. But he's also written very many essays, travel pieces, and a very interesting book, Word, Woman, and Other Essays.
Right, stand here, or can I use this?
Yeah.
Hi everybody. When Chandan asked me to talk here, my first proposal was to talk about food security, because I've been in recent times concerned with climate change and food security. And then I thought, well, it will get enough of people to talk about food security. So I'd rather talk about something which others don't talk about and which might be of interest to you. So I thought of this idea, parables for a livable world. And let me begin with a few disclaimers, because we are going to touch about cultural issues. I'm not a religious person, I'm basically a secular person. Some of these parables have to do with vision, with alternatives, etc. And so some of it might come across as high sounding. I just want to say that I don't practice what I preach. So rest assured about that. At least I'm not able to. We all try to live up to some visions, etc., but we don't always succeed. Let me begin with, briefly a small introduction about the kind of world we are living in now, and how perhaps most of us are not really aware of the seriousness of the situation. I myself, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, was not aware of how serious climate change was. I'm not going to frighten you, but for example, there are scientists like James Lovelock who says that 80% of the planet will be eliminated by the end of the century as a result of climate change. Temperatures rising, food shortages, flooding, countries like Bangladesh will almost disappear, go underwater, Maldives will disappear in the next 20 or 30 years. So there are, some would call them doomsday prophets, but they are serious scientists. So there's a small number of people who say that we are heading, there's no doubt about it, that we are heading for disaster. And so this raises then the question of even a word like development, which many of us use, and I'm sure you have a development studies course here. How relevant is development if this is the scenario? It means that development is also contributing to this disaster, and development might is actually making things worse, because part of the climate crisis problem is the fact that development requires energy. Much of our energy is coming from fossil fuels, and scientists are not in agreement. Some say temperatures will go up by 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Others some are talking about 10 degrees Celsius. You can imagine much of India will become unlivable by the end of the century. You guys will still be around when this happens. So in this context, what is the role of, how do you re-vision society? How do you rethink the objectives of society? What is the good life? We had organized a workshop a couple of years ago, an international work conference called What is the Good Life? Because our notion of the good life leads to a certain understanding of development, leads to a certain understanding of consumer society, which we take for granted. And we as a poor country in India, when I was your age, everybody was dying to have a kind of society which would resemble the US or the West in terms of consumption. to have middle class standards of living. Now, these very aspirations that we have struggled for are now going to lead to a very serious crisis, which we, call the climate crisis. Enormous food shortages, enormous shortages of water, temperature rises, humidity levels going high, malaria, which is not existing in the south of India, will come into the south of India in the next 20 years. So these are all the kind of things that are going to happen. I'm not going to touch about LC, no? No, you're not. You look like a friend of mine called LC Nagaraj, so I was wondering. So this is the background to the parables that I'm going to talk about. Why parables? Because in the old days when I was a student, there was, we were influenced by Marxism, and there was this whole question of what determines, what is the determining structure if you have social, socio-cultural, economic and political. The Marxists would obviously say the economic structure determines things. A professor in Paris, Louis Dumont, under whom I studied years ago, he said that traditional Indian society was marked by culture. Culture was the dominant determining factor, and economics, was a small part of it. That culture was determined. So my talk would be on the role of attitudes, values, and consciousness. Can we actually bring about any change in the world today without another frame of values, attitudes, beliefs, insights? Marxists would say you're putting the cart before the horse, that you have to first deal with economics. But anyway, we won't get into that debate now. Let me start with the first parable. One of our, I'll straight away go into the parable. There's this village somewhere in India, and this village has a number of wells. And there are frogs which sit on the walls of the wells. And as it turns out, each well has a color. Some wells are saffron colored, some wells are green colored, some are white and blue, etc. So the frogs, this is a very pleasant day in the morning. The morning starts off well, but it gets very hot by afternoon. So the frogs, as it gets hot, they sit on the walls of the well. And the frogs think that each one's well is the best well, with the best water. So the frogs on the green well look at the frogs on the saffron well, and they croak, my water is the best water, my color is the best color. Likewise, the frogs on the saffron well, there are rejoinders, they also croak. And this goes on, and by midday it's hot, terribly hot. And then this particular day, it's one of the hottest days of the summer, and they croak themselves to absolute hoarseness. And a few of the frogs then decide to go for a dip in their own wells to cool themselves off. They're exhausted with croaking at each other. So a few of the frogs, what happens is they go into the water, and some of them, I need to wait.
It's not.
Yeah, okay. So a few of the frogs go into the water, or the pool on, and some more adventurous ones go deeper, because as they go deeper, the water is cooler. And being so hot that day, they go deeper, and they find the water is cooler. And then a few of the frogs find that there are little crevices in the wells, in the walls, on the walls of the wells, and they get into those crevices where the water is even cooler. And they stay there, they go through these little tunnels in the well. And finally, when some of them come up, And when they come up, they find that some of the frogs from the green well have come up in the saffron well. And some of the frogs from the saffron well have come up in the green well. So these subterranean passages under the wells have led them, to come up in the wells of their enemies. Now, the moral of the story is that, as long as you remain on the surface, you will just see the colors and the divisions. But as you go deeper inside, you touch the common grounds of our humanity. That essentially we are human beings first, and only then are we, the color thing, green for Muslims and saffron for so-called Hindus, and blue and white for other traditions. So this is a little story to show that essentially we are all first human beings, and only then are we Hindus or Muslims or Christians, or it's our common humanity that we need to celebrate. And I think this is certainly one issue which in a country like India can tear this country apart. And I think there is a difference between celebrating differences and using differences to polarize society. I think one is not against differences. In fact, differences can be extremely enriching. So I think the frog in the well parable is, that there is a common humanity, and our different traditions can be seen as enriching rather than dividing. So that's one parable. Another parable has to do with the kind of, if you like, the dominant values in contemporary society. And this has to do with, there's a young ant, little younger than you guys. There's a young teenage ant, and let's say he's walking down Brigade Road. He's, he's a little idealistic ant. He wants to see, what is the purpose of his existence? What is the purpose of life? And he looks at the shop windows and sees all those fancy things being sold there, stylish stuff, but not attractive enough. He needs something stronger, something more attractive. So he keeps walking down Brigade Road, and then at the end of the, and then suddenly he hears a kind of a mesmerizing song, and it kind of grips him, and he runs towards that, from where the song is emerging. And as he walks there towards this song, he sees a kind of a, he's not sure whether it's a temple or a church or a mosque, something like a steeple or a mosque. And so he charges towards that. He says, this song is so attractive. And then he gets close to this structure from where this chant is emerging. And then he sees that it's actually a pyramid of ants. It's not a church or a temple or a mosque, it's a pyramid of ants. And this chant, or this mesmerizing chant, is really, it goes like this. Got to get to the top, got to get to the top, got to get to the top. So it's so mesmerizing that he also jumps. And these ants, this pyramid of ants, they're all jumping and scratching each other and clambering over each other to get to the top. So he also feels, this is what I need to do. He jumps onto the pyramid, and he also kicks and chants and is trying to race to the top. Anyway, the story ends with eventually one ant gets to the top. He gets to the top, and then another ant is following him. He gets to the top and he looks around and he says, there's nothing here. And the ant which follows him says, okay, but don't tell anybody. There's nothing here, but okay, but don't tell anybody. Now, behind this is the dominant value of individual competition, which is so fundamental to the modern world. Aggressive competition, where you're a climber, the vertical thing, you climb, you compete intensely at school, you compete at the university, you compete at the workplace. The other is not a relationship, the other is a threat. You cannot relate to the other. And at the age of 60, 65, when you retire, you get to the top, or almost to the top, but then you find there's nothing there. And this is again, if you look at the Enlightenment in the West, before the Enlightenment, you had the family, which was an oppressive structure. You had the trade guilds, which were oppressive. And individualism arose in that context as a liberative factor, to free people from, the bonds of family, church, trade guilds, which weighed down creativity, which weighed down innovation. And then today what has happened is, this individualism has kind of meshed so much with what I would call market fundamentalism, that the individual today is not just, I make a difference between being an individual and being a person. Being a person is you're autonomous, you have choices you can make. But being an individual is, today in today's world is become almost synonymous with a highly aggressive, competitive, vertical, you want to ascend vertically, as opposed to a horizontal way of life where you find your meaning and fulfillment in your relationships with other human beings. And when you're horizontal, you're also close to the earth. You're able to relate to the earth. The earth also is part of your being. So this is another major issue, because if you have this highly competitive individualism, then why do you bother about climate change? The important thing is to get to the top. It doesn't matter what kind of model of economy we have, as long as you succeed. If you had an approach which had a more horizontal kind of dimension to it, where you felt that human fulfillment is relational, your relationship with each other becomes very important. And human fulfillment is also related to one's relationship to the earth, to nature. The earth is not just merely, what has the earth become today? The earth is real estate, is mineral, is resource, something to be exploited. The earth is not something, if you ask a village woman what the earth is, she will say it's Bhumitai. If you ask any village, I live in a village, if you ask a village woman what the earth is, she'll say the earth is Bhumitai. The earth is mother. If you look at evolution, we have all, you forget about her, you can say that she's illiterate. She just sees the season, she just sees the earth producing ragi or rice or meat, and therefore she says the earth is mother. But if you look at evolution, we have all evolved from the earth. So we have co-evolved with the trees, with the mountains, with the streams. So there is a kind of symbiotic relationship which we have with the earth. And this kind of aggressive, competitive individualism doesn't allow us to see this relationship that we have with the earth. I don't think we can be complete human beings without being connected with nature. From here, I go on to another parable, which is, I call it the parable of the trekking sage. There's this story, these are not original parables, somewhere I've heard them and they stuck in my mind and I've reworked them and given them an interpretation. So this is a stopped somewhere on a railway junction, small railway station somewhere in India. And there is this sage who is bringing a group of foreigners to a temple deep in a forest. So they have to get off at the station and they have to walk for 2 hours, and then they arrive at a clearing and this temple is there, and they are planning to, some simple lodgings there, they are planning to stay overnight there. So the sage alights along with his band of followers, and just as they enter the forest, a number of Adivasis come there and they help to carry their bags. And the Adivasis do this regularly. They stand there, they earn a bit of money this way, and they carry the bags of the pilgrims who go to the temple. So, in this case, like usual, the Adivasis start carrying the bags, and these people are staying only overnight. So, the Adivasis are walking, and these foreigners and the sage follow the Adivasis. And they notice that every 6 or 7 minutes, the Adivasis stop and sit under a tree and sit there for about 5 minutes, and then all these chaps have to hang around. So by the time they reach that temple, they have made about 10 or 15 stops. So some of these foreigners say, these Adivasis are lazy people, or there's no sense of discipline, they're stopping every 5-6 minutes. Anyway, the sage keeps quiet. So that evening they have their dinner and they sit under a campfire. The Adivasis are also there. So the sage asks the Adivasis, are you guys okay? Are you alright? Not too tired? No, we are not tired, they say. The bags were not too heavy? No, not at all. We are used to carrying bags, 5 times that weight. Then he says, I noticed that you had to stop every 6 or 7 minutes. Oh, that we always do. He says, if you are not tired, then you have to stop so many times. He said, no, that we always do. So he persists. He says, tell me, why did you stop? And then one of them says, we stop so that our souls can catch up with us. We stop so that our souls can catch up with us. In other words, even the act of walking for the Adivasis, you leave the soul behind. So if you're not, so after 6 or 7 minutes you have to stop so that your soul joins you. Then you walk on again, and then you stop till your soul joins you again. I think it's an interesting story, because we are living in a world where even the language we use, we have to take the fast lane, make the fast buck, fast food, multitasking, and it's interesting. The story is asking, as human beings, can we actually live this type of, with these type of goals and attitudes, or will we experience collapse at some level? Can you actually become a full human being, living in the fast lane, making the fast buck, fast food and everything that goes with it, multitasking? These are the kind of things. I'm sure if any of you go for an interview after you finish your course here, these are things that, are you guys good at multitasking? Are you able to do 2-3 things at the same time? Are you quick? Are you smart at articulating things? Even if a guy who may not articulate won't get the job. So again, I had a friend called Raimundo Panikar, who passed away. He was a philosopher. And one of the things, I remember him making a distinction between techne and technology. He said that the characteristic of technology is acceleration. Techne goes with human rhythms. If you're bicycling, you can actually talk with another guy on bicycle. You can, not on our roads, but if you were on a road where there was no traffic, you could talk with each other. You could look at a stream or a mountain. But if you're driving a car, it's very difficult to look around and drive, So somewhere acceleration impacts your human rhythms, and you cannot really, with acceleration and with modern technology, live a sound human life. I mean, maybe he was kind of, using this to raise some questions about the role of technology in today's world. I'm conscious of there being only 15 minutes, so I'm going to tell you maybe one or two more parables and I'll stop with that. Another parable or story that I like to mention, let me take one which is there in the Upanishads. We have a sculpture. I live on a campus called Fireflies. Some of the APU staff have had their meetings there, and we have a sculpture there. And this is a story from the Upanishads. There are two branches, and on one branch there's a bird sitting there. And this bird is looking here and there. It's excited, and there's a bunch of figs on one of the branches. This bird is pecking away at these figs, and looking hopping around on the branch. And then nearby there's another bird sitting, and that bird is not eating, it's not moving, it's not looking here and there. It's just observing the first bird. The first bird is excited, hopping, eating. Second bird is not moving, just observing the first bird. Actually, the two birds are the same bird. But the first bird represents the active principle, and the second bird represents the observer. So, in a sense, what it's saying is that within each of us, there's this potential to act, to go through the motions of life every day, all the different activities. But there's something else which is observing us doing these different actions. What the Buddhists would call mindfulness, the beautiful expression, mindfulness. What in lay terms one could call self-awareness. So, the question is, are we living in a world today where the second bird is either absent or has atrophied, has wasted away? So the first bird has lost its compass. So it's our civilizational crisis that we are globally experiencing, the civilizational crisis. Is it a result of either the absence or the wasting away of the second bird? It's interesting that it comes from it looks like the human condition was always there. This is a story probably 3,000 or 4,000 years old. And it's a very interesting thought. Maybe you can tell me later when we come to the discussion part, what do you think? Do you think that the second bird is important? Is it alive? Or does it not matter at all in terms of careers? Or would it even harm your careers if the second bird were alive and I think I'll end with another little metaphor of the bow and arrow, which again is very, very similar to this two-bird story. It's the metaphor of the bow and arrow. For the arrow to shoot out, it must be drawn inward. There can be no outward journey without an inward journey. So the arrow can't shoot out without being drawn inward. So the outward journey depends on the inward journey. So if you apply it to our day-to-day life, what is the outward journey and what is the inward journey which comes before the outward journey? And I'm not talking in religious terms necessarily. I'm talking about what are the ethics, what are the values, what is the vision that we're connected with this inward journey. And there can be no outward journey for the arrow without an inward journey. So if there are arrows shooting out without being drawn inward, those are illusory arrows, because there's been no inward journey. So in terms of our civilization today, either as individuals or as a collective, as a community, what are these inward journeys that a person is concerned with or which a community is concerned with? What are the values? What are the insights? What are the visions? I think maybe I'll let you answer that. What would these inner journeys be? What is the second bird in our lives? If you're talking, I'm saying all this because you can look at development from another perspective. Can you actually have another society without changing consciousness, without changing values, without changing attitudes? Is the Marxist principle right that if you change the infrastructure, if you change the economic structures of society, that automatically you will have a new consciousness? So, which one comes first, or do they go together? I think these are very fundamental questions when you're talking about sustainability. And as I said earlier, some would even question the use of a notion like development. There are today thinkers who say that the problem today is development. Climate crisis is a result of development. Of course, it's easy to make a critique, not quite so easy to know what the alternatives are. How do we move towards an alternative paradigm of development? What should be the values within this alternative paradigm of development? Things would have looked, by and large, things were looking pretty hopeless, not just in India, all over the world. I go to France twice a year, and I lived there for many years, and I see in France this deep pessimism about the future. The whole of Europe has very high unemployment rates. There's a deep pessimism. Europeans by droves are trying to go to Australia. In Portugal, they're going to Angola. The Angolan embassy has long queues for people, Portuguese, trying to get visas to go to Angola, a former colony. There are no jobs there, or they're going to Brazil. So deep pessimism about the future. So, in India, we are, middle classes, educated classes are able to get jobs now. So we are on a high. Not all of us, because most Indians are, perhaps 300 or 400 million are living below the poverty line. They can't dream of finding jobs. But at least in our cities, our urban middle classes are going through this high. But a high within what Indian context, within what global context? The context of corruption, the context of poverty. You know, we are the largest poverty area in the world. We have more poverty in India than the whole of Africa put together. So, what do we do? Is it enough to change politics? Is it enough to tinker around with our development model? Very rarely do people talk about consciousness. Or if they do, it's either Hindutva or some Islamic extreme thing or some Christian missionary kind of a thing. These are the things that we hear about. We don't really talk about what are the values, what are the attitudes, what are the beliefs for any creative process to emerge politically. I stop here. I mean, you know, yeah. For me, I was talking with your Professor Vikas just a few minutes ago about this Arvind Kejriwal phenomenon in Delhi. If you turned on the TV in the last few days, you find the opinion polls saying that this guy is now, the electorate in Delhi gives the BJP candidate the popularity, I think 4%. And the Chief Minister, Sheila Dikshit, she gets 16%. And Arvind Kejriwal gets 25%. And this Johnny come lately, who even I didn't think he had the slightest chance. I thought it was a major mistake on his part to form a political party in a country like India. We're all used to wheeling and dealing, and somebody who's talking about clean politics, who's talking about putting, even if you contribute 10 rupees to his party, he'll put it on the website. You know, it's all supposed to be transparent. There's a good possibility his party might win the elections in Delhi. So what it means is that there are a number of people in India who are wanting to gravitate towards another kind of politics, another framework of values. From what, we all think that, as Indians we are stuck to this. Corruption is part of our way of life, wheeling and dealing is part of our way of life. Ethics and values will not inform our decisions. But yet this electorate in Delhi seems to be pointing that somewhere inherently there are values which, people are, maybe it's an urban phenomenon, I don't know. But anyway, it's a sign of hope that there is perhaps another consciousness at work in the minds of many people. So, it goes along with some of these parables that I've been talking about, because he says things which I watched him on this TV interview, quite, amazing things. Somebody asked him, because last year he went and broke a couple of electric meters in Delhi, saying that the electricity bills are too high, there are all kinds of companies who are wheeling and dealing behind, that's why the bills are so high. And it looked like he was breaking the law. And one young person in this interview asked him, you are breaking the law. And his response was, Gandhiji said, if there's a law which is immoral or unethical, you must break it. Now in this day and age, how can you be a serious politician if you say something like that? When I heard him say that, I said, he's got zero political chances in India. But no, people are beginning to gravitate towards that. If a law is unethical and wrong, you should break it. And and he's saying things like, even if we don't get a majority, we will not ally with the BJP or the Congress, because they are both corrupt parties. We will not form a coalition. So, and people are backing him. So anyway, it's just I'm sure you're aware of all what I'm saying, but it's suddenly, is there something hopeful emerging? Is there something in the consciousness of urban Indians or rural Indians? It's just a thought. Or are we kind of, doomed to this rogue capitalism. So there was an article in the New York Times last year which said India is going through this rogue capitalism, which the US went through in the 19th century, where you could do any crooked thing and get away with it. You could oppress, exclude, appropriate from the poor, do anything and get away with it. But India is going through that. This is a stage in capitalism that you can't avoid. So this is interesting that there is a political phenomena. If he wins Delhi, it will probably send shockwaves down the country. It will impact every political party because they know that there is something else happening within India. It's 5. So I'm sorry I kind of rushed through many of these things, these parables and stories. But essentially I wanted to, bring up, because very few people bring up these questions, because, you talk about parables and all, this guy must be religious, so he must be some kind of a wishy-washy character, not sticking with real things like economics or politics or development. But I think, the goals of existence have always been of concern not just to Indians, but to people all over India. And the notion of the good life, because it's the notion of the good life which is connected with our dominant development paradigm. The shopping mall. The shopping malls have become the temples of the modern world. They are the temples. It's these places which attract us. Notions of community culture, where in your communities you could be entertained, you could find fulfillment, you could find fun. This doesn't, it's increasingly absent in the communities. Therefore, we need to go to these well-lit places. Even if we don't buy anything, we have to walk in this dream world. So, this is the challenge. Is there another, understanding? I won't even use the word. Is there another notion of sustainable futures which will not lead to climate change, which will not lead to this kind of aggressive individualism, which will perhaps project several notions of the good life, different from the dominant model that we today have. Without that, is there hope? I would pose this question to you. Is there hope? Is development the answer? Or is development going to push us further downhill? I'll stop. What do you guys think? You can add, compliment, challenge, whatever.
So, what exactly is this sustainable development? When we talk about sustainability and we talk about the judicious use of the resources and applicability for the economic changes, so not all type of, but definitely as the nation, states, as the economic development, as the things move on and as the population moves on, keeping apart climate change for a while. So how to make this balance with the resources? That is the thing which needs answer. So what's your stand on this?
You have a position on it?
It's very difficult. That's why I want to just build up this.
Yeah.
I have some better you.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. It's not an easy question to answer. But perhaps, I can only talk about friends who are, I have a friend who is an environmentalist in Bangalore, Leo Saldana. Some of you may have heard his name. And I was speaking to him last week or a few weeks ago. And he and just him and a few villagers, a place called Challakere in Chitradurga district. The nuclear department, the defense ministry, Indian Institute of Science have all got together. The nuclear department is setting up some accelerator or something. I don't understand what it is. Defense ministry is setting up something. and they have taken up 10,000 acres of wetland near Chitradurga. And there is this, in Tipu Sultan's day, there was a cow, a breed of cattle, Amrut Mahal cattle, very, supposed to be a special breed of cattle. And Tipu apparently supported this cattle and did what he could to protect this breed. And this breed of cattle is found in those wetlands. And these people have taken that, and Leo filed a case against them. And Leo's wife, she's an Indian of Indian origin, but she has a Canadian passport. And what they did was, she's been living here for the last 25 years. She's got children who are 17 and 15, etc. They decided not to renew her visa. Somewhere the establishment started working. Fortunately, there were a few people in the Home Ministry who were sensible, and after she went from pillar to post, and finally her visa was eventually renewed. But then a couple of days ago, as a result of his bringing this up, the Ministry of Environment says, because the Ministry of Environment also has to say something to the court for the court to decide. Ministry of Environment says, in our records, this is not land which can be used for defense purposes or nuclear purposes. And it goes on to say, yesterday's paper or day before's paper says that the great Indian bustard, this is a nesting ground for the great Indian bustard. So, I think that we can all project idealistic alternatives, but in the end, we have to start with these issues of governance. Taking up issue by issue and dealing with it and having the courage, or he's just one individual with a few friends. Because not many people would like to take on this establishment, because again your phone calls will be tapped, your emails will be monitored, etc. But thank God that there are a few people like Kejriwal and Leo Saldana and others who are doing this. So issues, before we go to the alternatives, we have to come to these kind of issues. What is governance about? Is there a rule of law? If there are environmental laws, a friend of mine was the chief conservator of forests, the last one, and he told me, he is in Delhi, he told me every year he had to write off 30,000 hectares of forest. That is legally, officially, because of mines or something or the other coming up. Unofficially, perhaps another 30,000 or more would go. And he's a good. We were in college together. He's a good guy. But what can he? He just didn't feel that he could do. He had to say, okay. Despite Jairam, Ramesh, and all of them being there, they also made their compromises. There were enormous pressures from industry. So I think before we think in terms of, is there a notion of zero growth development? There are some who are writing these days of zero growth, that growth is the problem. But maybe these are difficult things to actually put in practice. What does it mean in practice, zero growth? So maybe we have to first start with the nitty-gritty of governance. We've got laws. These laws are being broken. Can we begin to, at different levels, just see that these things are work? Maybe that's the beginning to start a larger debate then about the development paradigm. There's one very interesting article which came in the New York Times. What's his name? Nicholas Christoph. His article, where he says that the number of people were, psychologists were intrigued by the fact that people hear about the climate crisis and how serious it is, and yet it's business as usual. So they made a study, and the gist of the study was put in this article, and there was this little example given that in this room if we discover a snake suddenly, somebody sees a snake under the chair or a cobra, we'll all jump up. We'll either run out of the room or move away, or some might even take up a stick, find a stick to chase the snake away or kill it. This article is interestingly entitled, "Is the human brain wired to self-destruct?" Is the human brain wired to self-destruct? In other words, if something immediately present happens like this, immediate danger, you'll respond. But if you say climate change is going to happen in 20 years' time and the impact is going to be felt then, the brain doesn't respond. So therefore the title is "The Human Brain Wired to Self-Destruct?" This is another, I don't know, why is it that, many of us are aware that we are doing things which are not going to work. We are talking about things that which are not going to work. Today, sustainable development is being used, the word is being used by private, the corporate world. And there's green capitalism and all that. It's all, much of it is probably window dressing. So these are kind of questions, very fundamental questions that we're sitting on. It's the base of just taking climate change. For every 1 degree rise in temperature, there will be a 10% downfall in food production. Rice and wheat will be impacted. We ourselves are working on millets. Millets, 65% of our agricultural land is dry land, rain-fed agriculture. Millets grow there, and yet the government has not introduced millets into the public distribution system. Only rice and wheat are here. We campaign in Karnataka, and the Karnataka government has now agreed to see that millets are provided in the PDS system. And when they find there are not enough millets to actually procure. But anyway, the fact that they have introduced millets in the public distribution system means that in the dry areas of Karnataka, the demand for millets will go, millet farmers will get a better deal, and from a point of view of nutrition, millets are better. From the point of view of climate change, millets use less water, or you don't need irrigation. Millets will also grow without chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So from a climate change perspective, because agriculture represents something like 20 to 25% of emissions, largely because of the emissions, nitrous oxide, etc., coming out of fertilizers, methane out of rice, the water that is stagnant, and the emissions, the methane emissions coming out of it. So it means that, in other words, if we move to a healthier kind of agriculture, we'll be bringing down emissions. If we eat more millets, if we eat more ragi, we'll be contributing towards diminishing climate change. If we practice organic agriculture, we'll be bringing down emissions. So these are all things within the framework of what can be done. So I think it's really at there's a larger debate about the paradigm of development. But at a more concrete level, there are things that one could take up and connect with. Yes, Vikas.
You told us that story, the Upanishads in which there are two
Birds.
birds. Now, if I'm not wrong, your original is from Nanda Upanishad, in which there are two
Yes.
birds in the original story or the verse. The second bird, couldn't care less, what happens outside. Because first,
I told you I've twisted things a little bit.
So there, the second bird is not concerned about what happens. So I guess, just talking about self-awareness of the inner self may not be sufficient, because some these paradigms could be.
No, that's why I think there's a paper I wrote called The Hermeneutics of Hope, whereby everything we come across, there's a need to look at its relevance for today. And how do you look at it in a fresh, so the second bird, you can look at it in a very traditional Advaitic perspective. There is oneness, there is harmony, we are one with the universe, and as long as you feel good, that's good enough. If your neighbor is hungry or starving, as long as you feel harmony, that's good enough. But today there are people, a friend of mine, Anantanand Rambachan in University of Minnesota, he is giving a completely new interpretation to Advaita. Something like Chief Seattle's notions of all things are connected. We are all connected. And therefore the pain of somebody else is our own pain. So it's not a kind of a feelingless Advaita. The joy of somebody else is our own joy. So so it's also important to rethink and rework, which very little of this is happening. The Hindutva lobby is doing that. They are rethinking it to give a certain perspective. Or the Taliban is also interpreting in a particular way. So the challenge of reinterpreting things and giving it a fresh perspective is important.
The other thing that I will continue.
No, you finished.
Yes, just no. You chose to structure your presentation around 5 or 6 parables.
Yeah.
Now the dominant mode of arguing up times is by proposing a theory or a need. So do you also see this choice of yours as a way of making different kinds of arguments? Because the present paradigm would be that I propose a theory and you either accept it or not accept it. Whereas parables are meant not to be proven or disproved, but rather they are meant to be enjoyed in aesthetics sense, and truth is or the meanings are to be derived differently. So by this choice of a series of parables, are you also trying to hint that we need to structure our discourses in a very different way than the current one?
Look at academic education in India. What are the issues India is facing, and where is academics today? Whether it's Bangalore University, I don't know much about Azim Premji University. Look at our universities. You can take up any subject and study it. It may not be connected with the real crisis and the real issues that society is facing. So these parables at least are connected with life. But you can do theory, you can build up theories, you can get into academics that have very little relationship to what is happening around. Yes, you were. Both of you, yeah.
Can I?
Sir, from the school observations and from my experience from school, I'm saying that this term sustainable development and the campaigning and awareness about the environment is very much into the fashion of the curriculum actually. But at the end of the day, the same child going to the McDonald's, eating in the McDonald's and get into the same kind of life which everybody is thinking is going against the environment. So my question is that how much importance we should bring into the education for the children to get this awareness of sustainability for the coming generation?
I think it's very fundamental. I think it makes me think of last year there was this gang rape of this girl in Delhi, and we are all aware of what happened there, and of how some of the people were so angry with it that they said that the death penalty, that's the only way to solve this problem. Very few people said that, how do we bring up our children? What has education got to do with gender sensitivity? How do you touch the family? How are children brought up in the family? This is a huge challenge. Probably the guys who were involved in that gang rape, there were probably millions of them, millions of such people in the country. Maybe at the spur of the moment something happened and their consciousness pushed them into that. But they're not unique guys. I wouldn't be surprised if that kind of consciousness, whether about 10 or 15% of the youth of the country have that. They may not actually do it, but that consciousness might still be there. So you're very right, you have to go to this, what is the nature of our education? Not just in terms of gender sensitivity, in terms of the environment, in terms of how we relate to each other, in terms of our civic responsibilities. All this is very important. One, two. You wanted to?
Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
I didn't understand, some things which are probably very basic, and maybe my inability to understand, comes from my fear of being static or the statistic, being static. Yeah. So what I am asking is, in your parable of two birds, being an observer itself would be an action, and sort of connecting it with your 0% development. So is it actually possible, and is it actually feasible?
Zero growth.
Zero growth.
I know some of these guys who are talking about it, and I'm not sure I've completely understood them, nor do I know, nor do I know whether it's possible to shift to that kind of a course. But I think the purpose of these people is really to make us think. The zero growth development, for example. No politician or, very few people who are practitioners know what to do with that. But it's making us think. Is the growth model, are we so sure that the present growth model is the only way out of the, is that the only model of development? Are there other indicators for human well-being? I know that Bhutan, maybe we all know that. They talk about gross national happiness instead of gross national.
If I can,
Yes, please.
drag him for.
You can also, share your.
Could you just collect a few questions? First?
Yes, maybe your question also. You have a question. Yeah, just mention your.
Yeah. Mention my name?
No, your question.
Okay.
And your name also.
Yeah, I'm Nazrul. I have a very basic question. When we talk about changing the whole value system or consciousness or attitude, and the problem is that how do we do it? Because one thing, and in my mind it comes that it can't be done in a classroom, or it can be done by books, it can be done by even changing the curriculum, pedagogy and everything. Someone has to live it, someone has to feel it. And there I see the contradiction, because unless and until, at least the kind of surroundings where I have been born and brought up, unless and until you consume, you can't know the difference between, as you said, the gross national product and gross national happiness. So I'm using a very broader term there. So how do you even go for that? And go for changing the values, consciousness, attitudes? We can change the skill sets, we can change the political parties, but values are very difficult things.
Maybe you can, I'm not, I don't necessarily have the answers to all of that.
Yeah.
Could you have any insight into that?
No, not insights. When I think about how my schooling was done,
Yeah.
I don't remember, I don't, because I have to remember what I read, but three things I found particularly interesting. I learned more from the teachers' personal lives, some of the teachers. Secondly, I have learned more from interesting books, and most of them were fictions. I have learned more from music, films, movies, very good movies, which are still ringing in my heart. And thirdly, I have learned more from interacting with people, interacting with my, my colleagues, my batchmates, my similar-minded people. So, but the whole system, I'm again talking about schooling, because that's a very basic fundamental field where we have to work, we are not giving any kind of thought even on these three things. So that's my problem with the whole attitude change.
Talking about education,
Yeah.
I worked with Paulo Freire for several years. I don't know if some of you are probably aware of Paulo Freire. And he had this what he called pedagogy of education, where you start from concrete issues. You know, the learning to read and write, you didn't start with ABCD. You started with what he called generative themes. You know, what is weighing in your consciousness? So for a poor person, it might be water, because you have to walk 1 kilometer to get water. For somebody living in a slum, it might be the word slum. So you learn to actually read and start with, instead of the alphabets, water. And then you have a discussion around water. You know, why is water weighing down so heavily on your consciousness? Because, you know, there's no water, you have to walk so far. Or there's a landlord who has water, but you can't access that water. He won't give it to you. Or why is the word slum so important? Because our commissioner of police a few years ago in Bangalore said that 90% of the criminals of Bangalore live in the slums. Do you know that? That the commissioner of police in Bangalore a few years ago said, Sangliana, he said 90% of the criminals of Bangalore live in the slums. So imagine if you are an impressionable young person living in a slum, it will reinforce those things. So education for Freire started with concrete issues, connecting, you know. You connect reality with what you're learning. Connect reality with what you're learning. You connect what you're learning with reality. It's an ongoing process of action, reflection, which I don't know if there are too many educational institutions in India or in the world which look at it that way. So that in the absence of that, you live in a kind of a rarefied atmosphere and talk about education. Yes.
So one of my questions was about just curiosity about your work with Paulo Freire, which you have answered.
Okay.
So the other thing was, you were talking about the example of the snake and the New York Times article on the mind being self-destructive. So I was thinking, you were saying that so many of us are aware of the kind of destruction that will happen, yet why do we choose to ignore it? Even to me, I mean, I think there's just a lack of awareness amongst, I mean, most people, maybe, the general strata of society, because we hear all these things about there's going to be global warming, there is global warming, and there's something might happen, destruction might happen, but it doesn't hit us. So, don't you think there is a lack of awareness amongst how it will happen and why it should happen? And secondly, this whole, I mean, the question of capitalism. So have you heard of Peter McKinnon's work on, what do you think of his ideas on critical pedagogy and building working class movements? And like when you are critiquing development, are you?
Yeah, I'm not really, you know, I've heard of him and I think had a discussion with some people. I'm not really familiar with his work.
Basically, he describes himself as a Marxist humanist, and but basically, when you're critiquing this idea of development and shopping malls and all of that, and you spoke about low capitalism. What are your thoughts on capitalism and in general development model?
Yeah, here again, you know, I think markets have existed from the beginnings of human history. So the problem is not the market. The question is what kind of a market. I think it's in this particular phase of our history we have a particular kind of market and a particular kind of a system of global finances and the role of global finance, where somewhere, you know, human beings don't seem to matter. These large forces, they become kind of more significant. And human well-being is not the criteria. So is that the only kind of market we can have? In the past we've had other kinds of markets. other ways of dealing with economics. It's not that we go back to the past, but is there a way of rethinking the dominant paradigm of the market? You know, what I would call market fundamentalism. I think today the dominant paradigm is a kind of market fundamentalism. And obviously, it's not leading to human well-being on the one hand, and the climate crisis is also a result of that market fundamentalism. So I think it's, and this is, you know, how do you account for a context like the West, you know, Italy, you know, Spain has, you know, today's BBC talks about 40% of Italians under the age of 25, 40% of Italians under the age of 25 are unemployed. I have a friend in France who is the, you know, he works in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and his two sons in their 20s, you know, they're 26, one is 26, one is 30. For the last 3 years, they've been trying to find a job. So how do you account for a highly technological society with the, you know, with the kind of intellectual capital, with the technology, all that creating such mass unemployment? There's something wrong with the system. There's something wrong with that paradigm of that model of economics, where you've got, you know, you're subsidizing your agriculture. Just 2% of your population is involved in agriculture. People are, you know, there are, you can see pictures of Paris now, you won't believe it, where the slums are not very different from the Indian slums. This Roma community, this gypsy community, on the outskirts of Paris, they have, you know, cardboard, plastic sheets, and all, and they're living in that kind of a situation. So obviously something is wrong. You know, there is a model, a global model of neoliberal capitalism, which is allowing this. Not just France, you know, countries like Portugal and all, it's just unbelievable. Greece, of course, has collapsed. Yes?
Just a few observations. See, as long as there is a great inequality in the society, the kind of disparities we have, there will always be pressure from large sections of the society to achieve material comforts that only a privileged minority has. So, having a discourse, you know, critiquing the growth models in such a largely unequal society runs out of momentum primarily because of the tremendous pressure that comes from aspirations that people have, especially because these aspirations have been aggravated significantly over the years. In fact, when you made the comment that when you were a younger person, I mean, in our younger age, large number of people thought of building a country and becoming equal to the United States, etc. I would actually argue it is much more that today than when we were younger. In fact, we were, in our younger age, there were much poorer sources of information. But the information, those who could get informed, was used far more efficiently than the way information is used today. And one thing which is often not discussed in most of these social critiques is the large amount of investment that actually goes in armed hostilities between nations. So a quarter of the Indian national budget goes to Indian defense, and likewise for Pakistan it will be even much more. And so one would actually wonder that why is it that given such a large amount of investment in these sectors, which are completely unproductive sectors, you know, one doesn't often hear of this, because at least in one way, the pressure for meeting the aspirations of people who are deprived can be met by diverting this investment from these unproductive sectors to sectors like education and healthcare, etc. And until that is done, it is impossible to, you know, have any meaningful discourse on critiquing, you know, the growth model, because these pressures will be there. And but this is not done. So at least one thing which I think, you know, genuine pursuers of critiques of the growth model have to start doing, and that is to question where is the money going? I mean, it can be off-the-cuff calculations can show that even 1% reduction in the defense budget can increase the salaries of school teachers by a factor of 4. 10 million school teachers in the country, right?
And look at the Colgate scandal.
Yeah, the Colgate is still, in fact, in many ways, that is probably not as big as what is going on in defense. In fact, the world economy, if you look at it, like there used to be a data from 20 years back that the annual turnover of the United States, more than 56% is in weapon industry, and likewise in the West, and etc. So this kind of an understanding that as if the hostile relationships between nations are there to be forever. So this is part of the paradigm, that the growth model, somehow coexisted. Also, this jingoism, which simultaneously has grown with religiosity, and everything has, the kind of religiosity that existed in past when we were young, and the kind of religiosity that exists today, which is far more aggressive, more hostile, more, in fact, has a corporate culture of its own, etc. So all these things are quite intermingled. And I have always wondered that why critiques of growth model or generally social critiques, why they ignore the issue of militarism. It's there, it's not that people are not aware, but it's like, it's like one of those sacrosanct things. You're not supposed to talk about the defense, but it is not sacrosanct. Somebody is benefiting from it. Who are those people who are benefiting from it? And unless this is addressed, and unless the issue of inequality is addressed, and then with the issue of inequality will come a lot of things. For instance, what is the language that we are having this discourse in? Whose language is this?
Our mother tongue.
Right. So there are many things which are related to the issues of inequality and where the money is going, and most of it, such a large amount is going into defense. These are things which we consciously ignore, and we need to question that. Why do we ignore that?
I completely agree with you. I mean, this has been, of course, for many years, the whole question of the defense budget and how much of it is could be used for more productive purposes. But I mentioned Colgate because for me, being involved in the climate crisis, one of the things that we don't realize is that coal, there's been talk now that we should, in some sectors, that we should get rid of income tax and have a carbon tax. Because let's look at fossil fuels. We just dig it out of the ground, whether it's petrol or gas or coal. And then most of the expense is basically transporting, digging it out, etc. And that's why alternative sources of energy, your question about alternatives, that's why alternative sources of other energy, whether it's wind or, these are not competitive. Because coal, you just dig it out of the ground. But the cost to future generations of burning coal, how is it going to impact future generations? The cheap coal, the relatively cheap coal. So if you were to think of a carbon tax, this would then make other sources of energy competitive. In fact, Australia, the last government had a carbon tax, but the new government, I think, has taken it off because industry is not happy with it. But anyway, these are thoughts for the future. Yes.
So you talk about the carbon tax, and we always bash capitalism that it has a negative impact on environmentalism. And then the environmentalists come with the new solutions like carbon tax or carbon credit and these on. And then the solution itself become a commercial purpose to use it further. So rather than creating a new solution and creating a new kind of commercialism, it's not fit to solve the problem in the capitalism itself, like solve the mechanism there itself and not create the further solution which can be commercialized.
He was also saying something about there are issues of governance. It's not as if capitalism was well regulated, if there was a kind of ethics, if there were priorities, whether it can be done is another question. But if the laws, if good governance was there, you look at something like the NREJ, because I have directly worked on that issue. How guys at the panchayat level and the, how they siphon away money, either false names or people are given only half the amount and the other half is pocketed. So issues of good governance can also, at least have some impact on poverty. But your question, the two examples you mentioned, carbon credit and carbon, they're two very different things.
Yeah.
Carbon credit is an opportunistic thing. Somebody in the West somewhere is trying to, he's not able to reduce his emissions, so he's saying, I'll give so much of money to somebody in India or Africa or somewhere. But who's the somebody in India? Some Birla or Tata will change some technology in some plant and say we are emitting less, and they get the money. The money is not used to grow more trees or go, see that farmers in dry lands can plant horticulture on their bunds. That's not happening. It's all siphoned off. Somebody will, is generating gas out of something. Usually the corporate sector is, for example, Sachin Tendulkar owns, and our friend Shah Rukh Khan, they all own windmills. And if you buy windmills, you can get some tax concessions and all these things because you're contributing to sustainability. And so all this is happening. You're right, but I think the carbon tax issue is a different thing. I think that is something that I don't think it's a gimmick. I think it's something that we need to think about. At least it's asking questions. What about future generations? The cost of using, if China is setting up one coal-based power plant every week. You look at Chinese cities, you can't see the amount of pollution. Have you seen pictures of Beijing, etc.? One coal-based power plant every week. Yes.
One observation. You mentioned the Bhutan's street from GDP to corruption happiness. Unfortunately, this shift in terminology actually has not meant much of the.
Yeah, probably.
No. They have possibly thrown out 15% of their population because they are not, Buddhists. Now,
because they are not Buddhists.
Yeah, because these are suspected to be foreigners, illegal immigrants, etc. You see, just by changing this, maybe would help, because this is, gross happiness is just as exclusionary as GDP.
Yeah. Sometimes these are gimmicky kind of notions when the state takes it up. Okay, Chandan, thanks.
Thank you.